up.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no worries about that.
Okay.
Because you've been here with your dad before, right?
Right, yeah.
Right,
He's
okay.
at flag football with it, with my grandson.
Flag
He's not a big
football.
horror writer, but I was trying to have her think of, she likes warrior cats and think of the cat battles or something.
Yeah, that would be
like
cool.
Instead of,
Cats can get scary.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, right?
All right. Awesome. So I'm waiting for, got some people who are going to be coming online and watching the live stream. So I'm looking forward to that. All right. Okay. So I'm going to give it just a few more minutes to see people show up.
I'm gonna say that.
Yeah, you're more than welcome to sit, and if you've got something to take notes with, you can join, because maybe there's something you pick up on that can help her, something that she misses, because kids are known to not fully focus. No offense, Ava. I just know how I was when I was your age, because I'm 42 now, and there are times where I don't focus.
I focus my brain on writing. I never even play video games.
Sometimes
She
though.
does a lot of writing, yeah.
Sometimes, though, video games have been very crucial for me in the last few years to develop things. Like, for example, in my last book, I have a character who's a cryomancer. So the character is able to manipulate ice with magic. And I got the idea from playing through Mortal Kombat 10 or Mortal Kombat X because Sub-Zero is a cryomancer. So I got some ideas from that. But something to think about.
She does, her dad does Dungeons and Dragons, and they do a game.
He does a podcast.
Yeah,
That's
he does a
awesome.
podcast, yeah, so.
I think it's the Dungeon Masters blog.
I've heard of that.
Oh yeah, he does it.
Okay, cool. All right, let's
They
see.
play a
And
little
he's
bit
been in,
themselves, yeah.
and he's been in Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters on an episode or two.
That's cool.
He likes it. He's also very good with tech. I mean, like he after Nintendo 3DS with a video.
Nice.
So now we can get any game that doesn't cost money.
I've done that before on my Xbox. All right, so we're gonna jump in. For those of you at home who are watching, which I don't know how many are on like now, but here we go. I like these new effects. All right, so just to give you a little bit about myself. We'll go over the introduction a little bit. We'll talk about defining what horror is. We'll talk about the place of fear. So these are going to be common phobias that you can work into your writing. Then we'll talk about suspenseful subgenres, tips for terrifying. So these are going to be the writing tips. And then we'll have a wicked writing prompt and then a chilling conclusion. I like having fun with putting these list items together because it was kind of fun. I will say up front that this is an adaptation of a presentation I gave about a year ago. Just kind of rehashing things, clearing things up, putting in some new content. That way it doesn't feel stale. So my name's Garrett. I am an author, I'm a podcast host. I co-host two podcasts, Storytellers, which is currently on hiatus at the moment. We just finished season 5 back in April. And then an ongoing Star Wars podcast called War of the Stars, which I have a lot of fun doing. We record about once a week, and it's an opportunity for me to geek out with a couple of other guys who are just as into Star Wars as I am. I have a fantasy series called The Archives of Isink Ran, which the first 4 books at least are here at the library for rent or borrow or whatever they do. But I also sell copies myself. My favorite genre typically to read is science fiction, but I'll read just about a little bit of everything. And then I do a YouTube channel called The Right Way, where this video will actually be featured later on this weekend. And so on that YouTube channel, we talk top 10 book recommendations, author interviews, and creative writing tips. In fact, next Saturday is the launch of my season 7 premiere. So that's already in the can and ready to go, and I'm looking forward to that. So we're going to talk first about defining horror. Now, Ava, what do you know about horror? What's your impression of it?
I get scared easily, so I don't really like it.
It's not uncommon for kids. I used to get scared really easily too, but one of the things I've done is I've worked through that, but kind of like forcing myself to watch or read those things that used to scare me. I remember being in like 5th grade and reading a Goosebumps book, and it got really intense for me. I'd take a break and put it down, and then I'd go back to reading it just because I needed to work through it. I want to know what happened next. But horror in and of itself is a fictional genre, and it's intended to disturb.
Yeah.
It's intended to frighten. It is intended to scare the audience.
Those are all things that it does to me.
Yep. And if it does that, then it's doing its job, because that's the emotion it wants you to have.
But I don't like when it's doing its job.
I can appreciate that. I can appreciate.
The most intense thing I can watch is anime.
Okay. Sometimes it's easier when it's animated because you know it's a cartoon. Yeah. It's different when it's live action because then it looks more realistic. So horror is often divided into 2 subgenres. Psychological horror, this is where things are very grounded, very realistic. This is usually where you have your serial killers or your slashers or some other kind of intense horror, usually affecting the mind. Then you have supernatural horror. This is where you have your monsters, your aliens, your kaiju, your ghosts, specters, goblins, and everything in between. And sometimes you can have a fusion of these 2 elements. Sometimes they're completely separated. All right, yeah, we've got, great, this is awesome. So I'm part of a network that our podcast is going through called Feast of Fandoms, and I was telling everybody about it, and so they're all tuning in, which is great. Hey guys. So psychological, supernatural horror. Now the funny thing is that horror actually has ancient origins. So for example, it's rooted in folklore. It's rooted in religious traditions. So like if you've ever watched Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, while that particular religious cult of Kali is, I don't know how realistic it is, they use, I guess, a misunderstanding of Hindu cults as the basis for the Temple of Doom and the cult that exists in that film. And because there is a horror element because they're doing human sacrifices. So there's kind of a quasi-supernatural, quasi-psychological element to that. It can be focused on death, the afterlife, and exposure to and overcoming forms of evil. All right. So typically when you have some kind of monster movie or slasher movie, it's some form of evil. All right. There's always going to be a conflict there. Pliny the Younger, he was can't remember if Pliny was Greek or Roman. Oh, ancient Greece. I have it right there. Pliny the Younger actually told a tale about a haunted house that goes back to like 3000 BC, something like that. Then Vlad Tepes III, Prince of Wallachia, he's a real guy. We call him Vlad the Impaler. He influenced Bram Stoker's Dracula. So Dracula goes by the name Vlad. And Vlad Tepes was actually part of the Order of Dracul, which means Order of the Dragon, which is where we get the name Dracula, which, for those of you who are online, I'm wearing a Dracula shirt with Japanese on it. So cool. Which we'll come back to Japanese folklore in just a little bit because that's some cool stuff in there. At the start of the 20th century, H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos came about, and there was a change from strictly literary horror to cinematic horror in the 20th century with the advent of film. That's when you start seeing variations. For example, one of the oldest vampire movies ever made was actually an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula, produced by a German filmmaker named F.W. Murnau, and he ended up calling it Nosferatu. It's one of the oldest as far as that style of filmmaking, and a lot of Gothic German horror elements to it. And they're actually having a remake coming out later this year with a current cast, and it looks amazing. A lot of practical effects being used for the film. And the original film was a silent movie. So there was just, the only thing you heard was whatever the musical soundtrack was to it, and all the dialogue was done as text blocks interspliced between the scenes. And then real life individuals such as Ed Gein, or the events that they were involved with, inspired slasher films and ghost stories in cinema. Ed Gein was actually the basis for the character of Norman Bates in the movie Psycho, and the book that preceded that film. And then Richard Matheson, who has written a number of different books in a number of different genres. He wrote a 1954 novel called I Am Legend. They made a film out of it back in 2007 with Will Smith. And it flips the traditional monster horror by making vampires the status quo. And so that title, I Am Legend, is actually played to the idea that the character of Robert Neville is actually the monster preying on the status quo instead of the vampire preying on humans. So really cool stuff in that. Now, horror is known for having a lot of tropes, and you see this more in film than you do in books, because in books you can play around with the tropes and do different things, whereas in film, certain things are tried and tested, and audiences respond in a certain way. But a lot of the times, it provokes an emotional, psychological, or physical fear response, because fear actually generates first in the mind and then in the body. And so it's a driving emotion that will either cause you to what's called a fight or flight response. I also call it a fight, flight, or freeze response, because usually when you're scared, you either want to run away, fight whatever it is that is facing you, or you freeze in place and you're just gonna get yeeted out of there. Then it's usually a situation, like I said, fight, flight, or freeze response. I kind of jumped ahead there. It offers readers a vicarious roller coaster experience with emotional release. So usually at the end, especially in good horror, all this emotion, all this tension begins to ratchet up and ratchet up and ratchet up, and eventually at the climax of the story, you get this release, and it becomes really helpful, very cathartic, because then all that tension that you've been feeling just fades away, it drains, and you get the resolution that you need. That's why, like, stories and shows that have a horror element to it, if they're doing their job well, Ava, what's going to happen is you're going to feel that, but once you get to the end, it feels like you can breathe easy, right? Oh, that's how it is for me, at least. Usually there's an exposure to evil, whether it's a serial killer, a monster, a ghost, whatever it is, you're going to be exposed to that. Technically, you look at Jaws, Jaws is technically horror, but the evil that they're facing isn't, it's not a sentient evil, it's not actively trying to just eat people because of this this choice to do so. It's just a shark. It's just doing what sharks do, swimming through the water and giving people hugs with their teeth. Because that's really what it is. I actually found out that sharks, their teeth are as sensitive as human fingertips. And so really what they're trying to do is they're trying to give us a hug. So I say, hey, welcome to the ocean, nom. And then, unfortunately, we start bleeding. And then they go crazy. Sharks be funny like that. There's usually a nightmare scenario. This usually might be the impetus that kicks off the story. This might be the thing that becomes the focus of what is happening. It just depends on what kind of a story that is being told. Usually there's abandoned places. Great examples of this are or like, for example, films or movies like The Haunting, or The House on Haunted Hill, or one of my personal favorite sci-fi horrors, Alien. The abandoned place in that film is actually this derelict alien ship on the planetoid of LV-426. The crew of the Nostromo show up there, and they find this derelict ship, and they go in and they explore it, which results in bad things happening later on. I'm keeping this kid friendly because I anticipated kids being here, but adult activities can get you killed. We'll just leave it at that. Yeah, there's a cursed. Usually there might be some kind of cursed artifact. Jumping back to Alien, they find inside that derelict ship a whole bunch of eggs, about 3.5 feet tall, about 2.5 feet wide, and the eggs are essentially cursed artifacts because if any one of those opens up, whoever's in that room is going to get got by the facehugger, and they're going to become basically the hosts for the alien parasite. The group splits up. This is a common trope in a lot of horror where you have people who are supposed to be in a group together and they decide they can cover more ground by going in different directions. And usually this happens a lot more in slasher movies where they split up and then the killer seems to be able to teleport around the location from like room to room or floor to floor or whatever, and he just starts picking off people one by one. Then there might be inclement nighttime weather. This seems to be a big one. Howling winds, storm, rain, whatever it is, usually it's happening at nighttime because that seems to be intrinsic with those things that cause us to be afraid. There's kind of a primal level where we get scared of the dark really easily. We get scared of what we hear or what we see or what we think we hear or see. In fact, there's a quote that I've seen on social media. It's not that you're afraid of the dark, or not that you're afraid of being alone in the dark. You're actually afraid of not being alone in the dark. If that makes any sense. Alone in the dark is another one of those tropes that pops up. And then lack of communication. Whether it's phones getting knocked out or no email signal, or maybe you're on board a ship and the radio system goes out, whatever that lack of communication is. What's interesting is if you look at, going back to my favorite film, horror film, Alien, the characters actually have all their internal comm systems turned on. So even if you have characters who are in different parts of the ship, they can hear each other talk in the event that something is going on because they're looking for the alien after it hatches. And it never dawned on me until I was watching it just a couple months ago that something was happening in that situation. Like they actually had communication. The only people that they couldn't communicate with was planet Earth back home. So they were stuck in the middle of this star system, traveling, and they still had like something like 7 months to get home, and they were stuck out in the middle of nowhere. There's always the phrase "I'll be right back." One of my favorite slasher film series is Scream. In the very first film, they talk about the rules of surviving a horror movie. And one of the rules that's laid out towards the end of the movie is you never say "I'll be right back" because you'll never be right back. And then like one of the characters who's not taking it seriously, he's like, "Hey, anybody else want something to drink?" They're like, yeah, grab me a soda. And he's like, "Okay, I'll be right back." And everyone starts laughing about it, and then, he's not back. Women and kids are last, or the final girl trope. You see this a lot in slasher movies. Alien has it with Sigourney Weaver being the final girl. You've got a cast of 7 characters, and she wasn't even the person who got top billing. Tom Skerritt was, and she was actually towards the bottom of the list as far as like the billing and all that, and she ended up becoming the final girl. She survives more than anybody else because everyone else gets killed. You see this with Laurie Strode in the Halloween film franchise. Jamie Lee Curtis plays that final girl and has been doing it for over 40 years. You see this happen quite frequently simply because that character is, there's something pure about that character, or they somehow are smarter than everybody else, or they're the one who has more common sense than everybody else. In fact, there's a sci-fi horror film called The Cabin in the Woods, which actually plays off of a lot of these tropes. It actually takes the 5 main characters and puts them into typical archetypes that you would see in a slasher or horror movie. And one character named Dana basically becomes the final girl trope, but she does it on her own terms. And they were the whole thing is based on the rules of the film. They're like, oh, you could die or not, we don't care, so long as you're the last one standing. And she's the last one standing, but it goes in a completely different direction. I don't want to spoil it because I think it's actually a really fun movie and it gets a little tongue-in-cheek, and it plays off of those tropes really well. And then there's one last scare. Jumping back to the Alien franchise, most movies are done as like a kind of a 3-act structure, where you act 1 is setting up the problem, act 2 everything gets worse, act 3 everything gets resolved. Well, at the end of act 3 in Alien, Sigourney Weaver's on the escape shuttle, she's blown up the ship, she thinks that the alien was on board and she's blown it up. Come to find out, the alien's actually on the escape pod with her. It blends in with the equipment that's built into the ship's control systems, and as she's sitting there plotting in her course, his hand just kind of sticks out and causes her to freak out. And the cool thing about that shot was that it was actually set up by director Ridley Scott as a jump scare for both her and the audience. Sigourney Weaver had no idea that the guy in the costume was actually in the wall of the ship, and she was never told about that. All she was told is the alien is actually on board and he will show up. She's like, okay. All of a sudden he says action, and boom, hand sticks out, and she freaked out. So her reaction is a legitimate reaction. And so it sets up a secret 4th act where she has to finally go head to head against the alien. So now we're going to talk about the place of fear. Okay, this title is I like using this because it's taken from I can't remember if it's the Maya or the Aztec, but they have a word called Xibalba. It's the place of fear, which is basically the underworld in that culture. And this is where we're talking about common fears. So I did a search for some common fears and phobias that pop out that you can apply with some level of accuracy. So the first one is nyctophobia. This is fear of the dark. This was me as a kid. I was afraid of the dark. And the thing that I did to get over it was I started turning off lights and walking around in the dark. I got used to being in the dark. So nyctophobia. The next one is coulrophobia. Fear of clowns. This is me now. I hate clowns. I refuse to watch it. I refuse to read it. Anything involving clowns except for Batman. The next one we have is pediophobia, which is a fear of dolls. It's very similar to the root for child, because dolls usually are in the form of children. But yeah, pediophobia is the fear of dolls. I don't really have so much of fear of dolls. I'm not a fan of them. I mean, I grew up with a Cabbage Patch Kid, for crying out loud. But I think it's the porcelain dolls that scare me more. Yeah. Although my mom has this 1950s Santa Claus doll. It's about 2.5 feet tall, and the paint on the beard and the face has faded over time, and so it's got these beady blue eyes. And I swear this thing is just absolutely terrifying. I call it the gnome from hell. And she ended up finding a second one, and I didn't know about it. And she set it up for a Christmas decoration in her house in Exeter. So my parents live here in Hanford. My mom has a separate house over in Exeter. It's kind of her she shed. And so I went over there one time, and it was just there staring at me, and I'm just like, what the? I freaked out and I left the house.
We had a freaking little doll.
We have fun and it always has fun and I hate it.
Yeah.
I hate it. I swear it's alive. It is.
Okay, so we can relate to that. Huh?
So the next one we have is xenophobia, fear of aliens. Now this usually is used more in more modern sense as like a fear of foreigners, and that is usually how it's applied. But xenophobia is also the fear of like actual aliens, like ET and xenomorphs and stuff like that. And so the reason being is because it has to do with how different they look from humanity. There's something that is familiar, but at the same time very, very different, very it's something very inhuman about it, and that tends to be what we associate when it comes to that fear. Then there's arachnophobia. This is also me, a fear of spiders. I don't like spiders. Earlier this week, I had to kill a wolf spider that was about this big around, and I had to crush it with a 1 gallon plastic jug because I wasn't going to get anywhere near it with anything else. And there's a scene in one of the Harry Potter movies, I can't watch through it because of all the spiders. Surprisingly, I'm a big fan of Spider-Man, that doesn't bother me. Then there's acrophobia, fear of heights. Anybody got a fear of heights?
Me. I get scared going up these stairs because I once fell down a flight of them.
Oh, I've done that before. Stairs don't bother me. It's like being up on a ladder really high. That freaks me out. At work, we have this lift for going into our multi-purpose room, and we have to like change out light bulbs every so often. And it is, I won't go up on that lift. I can't do it. Like I started to, and I got about 15 feet off the ground, and I'm like, nope. Then we've got thalassophobia. This is a fear of deep water or things living in deep water. And so I don't have a problem swimming in the ocean, but I won't go out further than maybe like 20 or 30 feet from shore. Once you get out into open water, no thank you, no sir. I once went kayaking out on over near Shell Beach in Pismo, and I found myself cruising over what looked like a little bit of a kelp forest. And I'm like, nope, bad idea. This is where sharks like to hunt for seals and otters. I went back to shore. Hemophobia. This is the fear of blood. Anybody have a fear of blood? No? Good. Me neither. I don't have a problem with that. Blood, guts, and gore, that doesn't bother me. And probably for good reason, because then I'd probably freak out every time I played Mortal Kombat. But a lot of people are. It's a very common fear, and it tends to freak people out. In fact, I know people that at the mere sight of blood, they will faint. If it's their own blood, that's not that big of a deal, but if it's somebody else's blood, they tend to freak out. My dad, like, he can't, it's not so much the blood, it's more of like needles and seeing injections. That freaks him out. Like, we were watching a movie one time and someone was getting injected like straight into the arm, and he's like, nope, turn the channel. Okay, oh, went backwards. Hold on, there we go. Work, there we go. Okay, so this is a quote from H.P. Lovecraft. He says, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. And so typically the things that we are afraid of, the things that we put into our scary stories are the things that are unknown to us, the things that will really creep us out. All right. Now we're going to talk about some subgenres of horror. Because we talked about how it's broken into psychological and supernatural. All right, but these are some of the suspenseful subgenres. We've got psychological, we've got our slashers, we have true crime, murder mysteries. Technically, those are more whodunit suspense stories, but there can be a horror element to it, depending on the nature of what's being done. Then you've got your supernatural stuff, and we've kind of talked about this as well. This includes ghost stories, monster horror, so kaiju, killer sharks, killer squid, killer cats. Actually, speaking of killer cats, there was Stephen King did a book called Sleepwalkers about these cat-like demons that infiltrated people's dreams and fed off of their life force. It was turned into a movie. It was not a good movie, but the creatures themselves, they look like humanoid cats, but they actually, like real actual cats, were a danger to them. And so something to consider, because depending on the culture that you're researching, cats have a strong tie to the underworld and to the spirit world, and so that's something that you can employ. Like if you've seen any of the movies in the Mummy franchise with Brendan Fraser, the first two are good. Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, not so great. They start changing cast around. They play fast and loose with the time frame, and you don't get and it's a poor use of Jet Li as a martial artist, because he doesn't really get to do much. He just stands around trying to look intimidating and spooky. But cats played a huge role in the first two films, because it dealt with Egyptian mummies and ancient Egyptian mythology. And so cats play a huge role in that, and cats are guardians of the supernatural. There's also cosmic horror. Cosmic falls into that supernatural. Cosmic horror is where you have things that deal with outer space, you deal with extraterrestrials to some degree, specifically things that deal with supernatural entities that are way more powerful than just your garden variety little gray aliens. We're talking things like Cthulhu and other ginormous cosmic entities along those lines. Haunted houses are always a quintessential story for horror tropes. And then, of course, we're getting into our tips. Yeah, so haunted houses. Cool. Got a good following today online. That's great. All right, so we're talking about our terrifying tips. And our first one that we want to talk about is, tip one is research horror subgenres. All right. You want to research different horror subgenres like psychological horror or supernatural or gothic or body horror or slasher horror. Each subgenre has unique elements and tropes, and you want to choose one that resonates with your story idea and build your narrative around those core elements. All right. Researching is key before you do any kind of writing, because if you're not familiar with it, you're going to find yourself struggling to write the story, if that makes any sense. The next tip, you want to develop a really strong concept. You want to start with a terrifying concept or premise. It could be a haunted house, it could be a cursed object, or a horrifying creature. Your concept should be original and have the potential to evoke fear. Make sure it's something that would genuinely unsettle or frighten readers. So I wrote a story about almost 2 years ago called Locking Up. It's a ghost story. I based the story right here in this library. And it's about a librarian who is locking up for the day. She's putting books back on the shelf in the kids' reading room, and she encounters a ghost, and it does not end well. In 250 words, that's a very short story. In 250 words, it evokes a lot of fear, and when I read it to my mom does not read horror. She does not like horror. As soon as she finished hearing the story, She wanted to know what happened next. Excuse me. All right, so that's tip number 2. Tip number 3, create relatable characters. You want to develop characters that readers can connect with emotionally. The more relatable your characters are, the more terrifying it will be when they face danger. Flesh out their backstories, their motivations, and fears. The horror should exploit their deepest vulnerabilities. So I just finished reading a book this last Sunday called In the Grave Where the Bones Are Still Wet. It's written by an author that I know in the Boulder, Colorado area named Calvin Ellis. So Calvin, if you're watching, I'm plugging your book. But this is the second book in a series. The main character, her name is Paisley Ma. She's like this 20-something-year-old YouTuber, doing paranormal investigations. And one of the things I like about it is we have this character who's incredibly relatable. She deals with anxiety. She wants to do the right thing. She's really good at investigation, but she has this tendency of looking before she leaps, and she doesn't think of all the ramifications, and this often leads to her getting in trouble. That puts her in over her head. But the thing I like about it is that she is so down to earth. She's really cool. She's genuine. She's kind. She's compassionate, and she genuinely wants to help people out, and that's what makes her such a relatable character. And even some of the antagonists, you find yourself relating to them, and how you start putting yourself in their position. You start, before you know everything about them, you start getting this idea of, man, what would it be like to be in their shoes, to deal with the things that they've had to deal with. To some extent, while they might not be necessarily likable, you can relate to them in some way before you learn the truth that they might be horrible people. Tip number 4. You want to build a creepy setting. The setting plays a crucial role in horror. You want to choose a location that enhances the fear, such as an abandoned asylum, a foggy forest, or a desolate town. Use descriptive language to create an atmosphere of dread, making the environment itself feel menacing. So, one of the things I do in that story I mentioned earlier, in Locking Up, is I talk about how the librarian is alone. It's dark, it's nighttime, and as she's there, power starts having an issue. Lights in the reading room start flickering. Her cell phone stops working. She's not getting a signal. Everything else is locked up. This is the only room that has lights on, and everything's starting to flicker out. Not only that, she starts hearing disembodied voices of kids. And then, like a teddy bear, starts dancing around the puppet theater in the corner of the room. So having stuff like that, setting that tone, can get really, really creepy really quickly, because it starts invoking some of those fears, those phobias that we talked about. And the stronger language that you use, the stronger word choices that you make, can help really evoke that creepy setting. I think one of my favorite, it's horror, but it's kind of a comedy as well, as a movie called The Frighteners by Peter Jackson, starring Michael J. Fox. This came out back in the late 90s. Really fun movie, actually. And the climax of the film takes place in an old asylum from the 1950s or 60s that had a massacre take place in it. And as Michael J. Fox's character, who is kind of psychically connected to ghosts, as he's moving through this asylum, trying to rescue another character from being hurt, he keeps having these flashes of the past. He keeps finding himself back in the 1960s, revisiting visions of how the massacre played out. And there's one scene where the killer comes right up to him face to face with a shotgun in hand and pulls the trigger, and he flinches And he realizes he wasn't shot, but it was real enough for him to feel that. And so the closer he gets to what is happening, the stronger those premonitions get. All right, so the next thing you want to do is you want to create, an eerie atmosphere. You want to build tension through atmosphere. Use sensory details, sounds, smells, visuals to immerse readers in the scene. The subtle creaking of floorboards, a flickering light, or a sudden chill can all contribute to an unsettling atmosphere that keeps readers on edge. All right? Then you want to establish suspense and pacing. That's tip number 6. Suspense is key in horror. Slow build tension, teasing the threat without revealing it too soon. Use pacing to your advantage, alternating between slow, suspenseful scenes and fast-paced, terrifying moments. This keeps readers engaged and constantly anticipating the next scare. One of the films that does this the best is the movie Jaws from 1975, which is almost 50 years, it'll be 50 years old next July. And one of the things that it does well is that it creates these slow, suspenseful moments. You know the shark is there when you can't see the shark because you hear the music and you see the camera's perspective underwater. All right? In fact, what you don't see is much more intense than what you actually do see. That way, when you finally do see the shark in full body towards the end of the film, by this point, you get that emotional release because now you see just how big the danger is. In fact, the first few times the shark attacks anybody, you hardly ever see it. It's not until like midway through the movie when you have that huge dolly zoom on the sheriff's face where he realizes just how big the threat is. All these people are swimming at the beach, and all of a sudden, this kid on a pontoon boat gets attacked over in a lagoon where nobody is paying attention. And it gets brutal. And you barely see the shark. You just see it come out of the water, its fin crests, and then it goes back under, and then there's just blood. And that is more terrifying than actually seeing the shark attack. The next one is you want to add in some psychological horror. Even if you're doing something that's supernatural, you want to have some psychological element to it. Okay? You want to explore the characters' mental states and their fears. So what is it that they're afraid of, and play off of that. Psychological horror delves into the mind, making readers question what's real and what's imagined. Use unreliable narrators, hallucinations, and paranoia to blur the lines between reality and nightmare. Having those kinds of elements can really play with your audience because then they're not sure what's real, what is happening, or what isn't happening. Because what it does is it keeps even the reader and the characters second guessing what's really happening. Then you want to imply the horror and let readers fill in the gaps. When writing scary scenes, focus on what's implied rather than explicit. Let readers' imaginations fill in the blanks. Describe just enough to make them uneasy, but leave room for their minds to conjure the worst possibilities. The unknown is often more frightening. So I'm going to jump back to talking about Alien. The first time you see the alien in full body as a grown-up adult alien, you've got a character by the name of Dallas going through the ductwork of the ship. He's searching for it because they still think it's this tiny little snake-sized creature, and they're not expecting anything bigger than that. And he's using this motion sensor to detect movement. And this thing is tracking him through the air ducts. And the last time we see Dallas on screen, he's moving into the next air duct. He turns, he pans his light. There's the alien. It's a huge jump scare. It reaches for him, and then you never see him again. And it leaves the question, well, what happened to him? Mm-hmm. Did he get killed? Did he get captured? Is he being cocooned and used later for a host? We don't know. There's a deleted scene that shows what happens to him, but having the deleted scene being removed from the film actually makes it more terrifying because you don't know.
Right.
Then, you want to avoid cliches. Cliches are good for a reason because we become familiar with them, but you want to avoid them. Horror as a genre is full of cliches, so the goal is to try and subvert them. So you want to avoid overused tropes like the final girl, or the creepy twins, or goes into the basement after hearing a chainsaw, unless you can give them a fresh twist. Innovation in horror is key to keeping readers genuinely frightened and engaged. I'm going to mention my friend Calvin again. His new book does this really, really well. There's a chapter where the main character Paisley is invited over to this family's house for dinner, and she suspects that they may not be on the level, that there may be something wrong with them. She's been picking up clues. She's not entirely sure why she doesn't trust them, and she wants to go and investigate their basement because she thinks that there might be a kidnapped girl in that basement. The chapter before this is told from the perspective of a little girl who's chained up in somebody's basement. And she is told that they're expecting someone for dinner. And all she sees, or all she hears, is the voices of them eating and having a meal, and she kicks their washer and dryer, which causes a noise. And so when you jump to that scene with Paisley eating dinner with the family, she hears a noise down in the basement. But when she finally gets down there into the basement, she breaks in and goes down into their basement, there's nothing there. It's a normal, clean basement. So it plays on that idea of there's something down there, but there's nothing really down there. All right, and this is where we get to tip number 10. Apply red herrings and foreshadowing. So what I just talked about with using that trope of going into the basement because you suspect something, that was actually a red herring. A red herring is where you foreshadow just enough, but then you kind of flip the script on the reader. Just when they think they know what you're going to do with that story plot line, you take the rug out from underneath them. So foreshadowing builds anticipation and dread, hinting at what's to come without giving it away. Red herrings mislead readers, creating surprise when the real horror is revealed. Both techniques add layers of complexity to your plot and heighten suspense. Okay? Avoid cliches as much as you can, unless you can reinvent them. But if you really want to plug in that cliche, do it in a way that becomes a red herring and messes with your audience, and then foreshadow something else. Tip number 11, you need a good villain. You want to create a good villain. Whether it's a monster, a ghost, or a deranged killer, your antagonist should be formidable and terrifying. One of the things I like about comic book literature is that a lot of the times the villain is the same as the hero. They're just a twisted version of them. So you look at the first Iron Man movie. You look at Ironmonger. It's basically the same thing as Iron Man, just beefed up and made to look better, but not as innovative as Iron Man himself. You look at Thor and Loki. Thor and Loki are two sides of the same coin. They're both Asgardians. They're both incredibly strong. They're both incredibly powerful. One is heroic. The other one is scheming. So physically, they're not the same, but at the same time, they have their own skill sets. You look at Captain America and Red Skull. Both have been exposed to the super soldier serum. Both are super strong. Both have their best qualities, or in Red Skull's case, worst qualities, enhanced by the serum. They fight for completely polar opposite reasons. All right? Sometimes having a villain that mirrors the hero is a good thing. But you want to give that villain a backstory that explains why they're so dangerous. You want to keep them mysterious enough to maintain an aura and a fear and unpredictability. That's what makes Jaws so terrifying, is you don't know why the shark is doing this, other than it's a shark. All right? It preys on the idea of the fear of the unknown. It plays on the fears of what's out in the deep water, of sea monsters, essentially. And it is incredibly terrifying. On top of that, you look at, again, Alien. Nothing is known about this creature. Its life cycle is a mystery before you even see it on screen. And when you see it on screen, it is terrifying. It is gross, it is disgusting, and it plays off of additional fears in that regard. But the villain is so good because you don't know why it's doing what it's doing. The only description that we get is about 2/3 of the way through the movie saying it is a perfect organism, unclouded by morality. It simply does what it does. That is it. There's no rhyme, there's no reason. It just kills. And its life cycle is designed to kill. All right? The next thing you want to do is you want to write a gripping climax. The climax should be the most intense, the most terrifying moment of your book. This is where everything has ratcheted up to the highest point possible, and that horror comes to a head. All the tension that you've built should explode, leading to a resolution that feels earned. The climax can be shocking, it can be tragic, or even leave some mysteries unresolved for a lingering sense of dread. I'm just going to leave it at that. French twist. No, not French twist, fresh twist. I'm loving some of the comments on there. All right. Tip number 13. I swear we're almost done. You want to end with an impact. The ending of a horror story can vary. Some end with closure, while others leave the horror unresolved. So the one that comes to mind for me is A Nightmare on Elm Street. One of the things that makes that film, especially the original film, so terrifying is because half the time the audience and the characters don't know if it's really happening or if it's just a dream. It's happening while they're asleep. And sometimes they don't even know that they're asleep until it's too late. But what's interesting is at the end of the movie, just when you think everything is peachy keen, everything's great, you get this really weird sense of something being off kilter, and then the mom is pulled through the door by Freddy Krueger and collapsed through like a very tiny window. And that's the impact right there. Just when you think everything is safe, Freddy's back because he's a supernatural entity. He can't actually be killed. He's essentially the boogeyman. The more fear you give him, the stronger he gets. So you want to choose an ending that suits your story and leaves a lasting impression. A twist or an ambiguous conclusion that leave readers haunted long after they finish the book. All right. And then lastly, you want to experiment with your style and structure. Don't be afraid to experiment with narrative structure or writing style. Horror can be particularly effective when told in unconventional ways, such as through fragmented timelines or non-linear storytelling, unreliable narrators, or epistolary formats, which are like diaries, letters, etc. So Dracula, Bram Stoker's book, is actually not written as your traditional narrative. Everything is done in an epistolary style. Everything is either done through letters, through journal entries, diary entries, or correspondence through telegraph. What's interesting is not a single one of the chapters or entries in the book is actually written from Dracula's perspective. So any interaction that you get with Dracula is always colored by some other character's perception, whether it's Jonathan Harker or his wife Mina or Van Helsing. It's all colored by somebody else's perspective. How he looks, how he sounds, his mannerisms, his behavior. It all remains consistent, but you're getting different versions of him depending on which character is telling you about him. So that's where things get a little tricky. In the Grave Where the Bones Are Still Wet by Calvin Ellis. That book plays around with a nonlinear storytelling. And it's really kind of cool because like it took me, I read through about a third of the book before I made that connection that something was out of place with the timeline. And thankfully Calvin was on hand to answer my question. He's like, you picked up on it, great, keep reading. You're going to enjoy it. But playing around with your style and with your structure can really make more of an impact on your reader. And that's ultimately the goal. So, here is our writing prompt. So for those of you who are tuning in online, thank you. I'm really appreciating the feedback. This has been great. You get to participate with us on a writing prompt. And here's our writing prompt. Okay, hopefully you guys are able to see that. I know it's kind of a weird angle. You're going to read the following prompt and continue the story. The sound of something whispering in my ear was not that of a human voice, but something far more dangerous. I now knew I entered a place where reality's boundaries could be easily manipulated. So I'm going to give you guys, let's see, what time is it? Oh, perfect. We've got 33 minutes before we were wrapping up. I'm going to give you about 20 minutes. You can turn the, if you've got enough light, cool. But I'm going to give you guys 20 minutes to write a prompt. For those of you who are tuning in online, you're more than welcome to send it to me through social media, or you can go on into the comments and post the continuation. Be my guest. But I'll leave the live stream going. All right. So the sound of some, if you want to write down that prompt, you can, but just continue writing it. There should be an evaluation sheet on there. If you can fill it out, that'd be great. not a single one. You know, for those of you guys who are tuning in, I really appreciate it. This is probably one of the biggest live streams I've done, so I'm glad that you guys have been a part of it. If there's something that you have a question about, you can leave that question in the comments, or you can connect with me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at GKJ_publishing. If you aren't connected with me on there, I'd love to have you guys. So yeah, one of the things that I did want to share is that a week from today is the season 7 premiere of my show, The Right Way, on YouTube, and so you'll be able to catch that. I mentioned it at the beginning of the live stream, but I think you guys will get a huge kick out of it. I've got a great new season lined up, and one of the interviews that I have will be with Calvin Ellis, talking about his new book. So yeah, at this point, if you guys want to sign off, you're more than welcome to. I'm going to be wrapping up here shortly, and but if you do want to connect with me, I've got all that information here. I love that effect right there. That is so cool. So again, like I said, Instagram and X at GKJ Publishing. YouTube is GKJ Publishing. You can find me on my website, archivesofthe5kingdoms.com. You can send me, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to send your writing prompt responses to me on email for review, gkjpublishing@gmail.com. And if you want to give a one-time donation, you can send me something on Cash App, $GKJ Publishing. Anything that you're willing to give, it would be great. You don't have to. Like I said, it's just it's an option there. Anyway, I hope that you guys have a great rest of your Saturday. We have a Renaissance Fair going on today, and I'm going to see what I can do about sneaking in to bypass the $5 charge that the city is deciding to impose for the first time in like 40 years. So, yeah, see what I can do there. Anyway, peace. Have a great time.